we're in this moment of civilizational breakdown. The old way is dying. We're living out the new way. And there's something about being on the bleeding edge of that is akin to flying too close to the sun. There's a healthy awareness of the fragility of our lives and the freedoms and the luxuries we take for granted that I think is a powerful investment of our time.
Hello and welcome. It's so good to be back on air with all of you. I am looking forward to being in person with some of you very soon for my beautiful leadership retreat at 42 Acres in Somerset. Despite what I share in this podcast, which is more personal than usual, I'm feeling really good and resourced to host this retreat. We have a great support team and we'll be with our nature allies on this incredible land as we spend time tree whispering and foraging, as well as engaging in embodiment practices and leadership workshops. A retreat offers space to come and be transformed through the community that gathers and the moments that are shared. There is possibility for just a couple of you to jump in now if you so wish. You can find out more if you head to our events page and follow the links. My guest today is Ronan Harrington, who is a resilience expert and public voice on the transformative power of adversity. He advises organizations and institutions, including Deloitte, KPMG, Sky, the UK government, and Oxford University on how to move from burnout to resilience. He has held a variety of roles, bridging the worlds of personal and societal transformation. As a lead futurist to the British Foreign Office, he wrote a report for the British government on the world of 2030 and how the UK government should respond. He coordinated the political strategy for Extinction Rebellion in 2019. He was the founder of Alter Ego, a European network of political leaders and activists advancing the connection between spirituality and progressive politics. I was one of the facilitators for the very first Alter Ego gathering. I've known Ronan now for many years. We met sharing stories into a giant cauldron at a transformative gathering and have been in intersecting networks and communities ever since. I didn't ask him for his call to action at the end of this podcast, as some tech issues meant that we didn't have space. You are soon to hear more about this, but his call to action, which I wanted to highlight, especially for those feeling a bit estranged from politics, is to re-engage by supporting someone who's on the front lines. This can be as simple as an hour a week, finding some way to support them. And especially if you're involved in facilitation or mentoring or coaching or healing of some kind, that these things can be really valuable resources to activists and help them with their own resilience, as can financial donations. A nice example is Paul Powsend, who Ronan is personally supporting, who is leading the River Roading Trust, which is regenerating an ecosystem in the heart of London in Barking. It's a really interesting example of, rather than people moving away from areas of decay, actually staying there and revitalizing them and making them beautiful and inspiring the community. In today's conversation, called Flying Too Close to the Sun, we explore the themes of resilience, cultural change, and burnout as we speak to the question, how do we grow steady legs of resilience in uncertain times? I hope this conversation gifts you with more resources to support your own resilience and therefore our collective story. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. Ronan, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you onto All That We Are. Thank you so much for coming to share today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us, what are the futures of your wildest dreams? What does that mean to you?
When you ask me the question, what comes to my heart is that people who are in situations that have real enduring adversity, really no matter what that is, whether that's their health or broken relationships or things as big as war, that they experience grace. And I know that that's not a logical answer to the question, but somehow I really feel for people who are in these situations where there doesn't seem to be a logical way out. And yet there's also this hope that something may happen that may shift it. And it's a personal question for me because I have a complex chronic health condition that, I've on the logical level have done everything to try and solve and get better, and yet it's still there, and it's a real source of suffering in my life. And I just imagine what it would be like to experience the grace of actual healing, and it feels so impossible. So that's why grace came to mind.
That's really beautiful. Is grace tied into that situation resolving, like the healing of something? Or is grace an experience of being able to live with whatever it is that you're living with in a way that you still feel connected and alive and hopeful?
Many people would say that, in relation to my own life and this health condition that I have, that many people don't know it's going on for me, because I suppose I do hold it gracefully, or as gracefully as I can. Obviously, there are many private moments where I'm in despair and in grief, and yet it's kind of, what is the alternative but to try and accept it and continue living your life. But the grace that I'm talking about here is the grace of God, whatever that means. This feeling of a reprieve that you didn't enact through your own volition and your own will, but actually the circumstances beyond your control conspired to bring you something that matters so much to you. So that's the territory that we're in, and it's an unfamiliar one.
We're talking about like the miraculous, like something that can come in where a deep prayer is answered.
We are. And, I think it's a quote from Charles Eisenstein that what we consider miracles and magical are forces that we don't understand yet. I think about, again, in the realm of health, people who have been diagnosed with terminal or lifetime debilitating, like savagely debilitating health conditions. And there can be advances in medicine that, on one level, are a very logical progression of scientific understanding. And on another level, if you take a step back from it, they're a complete miracle. When I talk about grace, and I'm even saying that it's an act of God beyond, our own personal will, I'm not excluding that it could be very normal developments in the progression of society that could bring this reprieve for people. If we take something different, a different ailment of like really savage chronic loneliness in society, and how many people go about their entire days and weeks and months without anyone to confide in, and how so much of that is structural, like just the inability of planning laws to allow people to live in community and to experience the healing of that, and how that can be tackled through changes in policy in a very practical level. And yet the experience of it, to the person who is in a deep feeling of loneliness, it can feel like an act of God, as did, the National Health Service in the 1940s in the UK. It's a miraculous act that completely changes the game. And so, as I speak, I feel myself that we're touching upon this idea of how great political acts, because of their power and because of how many lives they touch, the best of them are miracles. And I think there's something interesting there.
I love that the political could be miraculous and that policies, be it something like universal basic income or some of these things that would literally just transform the way that we are able to live. Another one that I've been contemplating a lot is, you know, a national care service, because I've been experiencing upfront how broken the care quote unquote industry is, and how that strips away dignity, and it really just pushes the person that needs care and everyone around them to the edge, from not being resourced very well. And I suppose there's a lot around border laws as well that at a time like this would feel like acts of grace. Unfortunately, a lot of them are going completely in the other direction.
Yeah, and I suppose we also have to look at what we hear about more, which is decisions that have huge, far-reaching and deep personal consequences for people that are so beyond their control coming through politics. You talked about borders, and the revoking modern slavery laws for illegal migrants in the UK is a very timely example. What people in Ukraine have experienced over the past year at the whims of essentially one man. And I think that explains a lot of our disenchantment from politics, is just that we don't have much control. And yet, if we look back on our history, so much of obviously the freedoms that we can often take for granted are the product of miracles that were created because of enormous personal sacrifice and collective sacrifice. So I love this quote from Charles Peguy. He's a French essayist, and the quote is, "Everything starts in mysticism and ends in politics." And I love that idea that these revelations that we have that are so deeply personal that they could only be described as mystical. They're beyond the faculties of the logical mind. They come to us in these deep states of reflection and prayer. That's often where we get our visions for the world of tomorrow. Obviously your podcast excavates these from the souls of the people who are on the podcast and brings them into the light and makes them tangible. And yet the process of them not just staying there as fanciful ideas, but actually becoming institutionalized into the architecture of society is a political process. And one of the projects that I did previously, it's on hold for now, was Alter Ego, which was a gathering of activists and political leaders across Europe who were looking at this integration of spirituality and politics and the mystical and the political. It feels really impossible to bring those two worlds together, and yet it's like it has to happen.
How do you see that it can happen, especially when we see trends that are going in the opposite direction?
Yeah, so if I'm being really honest, I'm now 36. I think when I was 29, I had such a burning fire in me to make that happen, and to bring people in the political space and also in the spiritual world and the kind of the culture change world that's inspired by spirituality together to figure out an answer to that, in the context of everything that we see from populism to climate crisis. I got severely burnt out just trying to figure out that answer, and was left very cynical and had to kind of move away from it, because in a way, it's heartbreaking to sincerely attempt it and to see the expressions of it politically always, and again, this is just my assumption and from my experience, but always seeming to be a little bit marginal, a little bit parochial, a little bit provincial. We have plenty of examples of flat pack democracy in Froome, or there's even bigger examples of Barcelona on Camus, who took over the mayoralty in Barcelona and enacted a lot of progressive things. But I'm yet to see figures and parties who are kind of unabashedly championing a revolution in human consciousness and a deep cultural renewal that is in any way relevant or effective at the ballot box. There's moments when political campaigns can can kind of turn away from a politics of fear to a politics of love. I know there was a political movement in Turkey that had a lot of success, again, in city elections based on that. But given I think we're in such a moment of spiritual renewal in the West. There's such strong themes that are coming from mental health crisis and things like that, that it still surprises me that it has yet to find a footing in politics and the everyday conversation. So I don't have an encouraging answer to your question.
And in that process that you went through with alter ego, what are if you can like peek beneath the burnout, because I know that when you've got burnt out from something, it can also just be like, like I need space. But like sort of through the embers of what was created with alter ego and the gatherings that you had and the conversations that you had, what do you feel like the sparks are of possibility?
What comes to mind is another quote, and these quotes really were informed our thinking in alter ego. And it's a quote from the philosopher Richard Rorty, and it's a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. I really love that so much. I think what it speaks to, the spark it speaks to, is when someone in the public arena chooses to speak differently. They speak either from like genuine vulnerability and disclose themselves and reveal themselves in ways that really move people. They choose to not enter into the kind of the psychodrama of adversarial politics and the misleading, but operate from a deeper level of integrity. That's actually what we're hungering for in public life. There's so much falsity in public life. There's so much bullshit that it's just so stale, if not odious. When someone comes along and actually speaks the truth, or even their truth, and we can feel it, it's like oxygen. We're starved of it. And I feel that a lot of the politics of the last kind of 7 years since Brexit and Trump, obviously the seeds of that are, many decades. But I think that there was a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a kind of a type of false authenticity. People like Trump and Johnson who were so visceral, you could just really feel them in their energy and in their presence, and they spoke a type of language of the soul. They spoke to really base instincts within us. And a lot of the impetus for alter ego, there was this kind of ambition of what does it look like to bring together spirituality and politics. But on a more refined, practical level, it was the idea that progressive politics has lost its soul. It's lost its ability to speak to people at that deep level. And it's knowing that without that, it's very difficult to stir people out of inertia and apathy. I really like how Mick Lynch, the leader of the trade unions in the UK, is speaking right now. He's speaking with this kind of refreshing, calling bullshit honesty that I think is really infectious. But again, these examples are few and far between. You could contrast that with Keir Starmer, who I think the leader of the opposition party in the UK, the Labour Party, who is so careful in his sound bites. It's like, how can I say as little as possible in order to get over the line and just get Labour elected? I also understand that there's a lot of tactical merit in that, but almost beyond the instrumental goal of winning power and changing policies, there is something about this hunger for truth in public life and living in a sea of fake news and extreme views that is burning us out, that is exhausting us. I suppose I'm curious to ask you, as someone who is leading a media initiative that's articulating this deeper truth in public, I'm curious, just for your reflections and what you see.
In relation to the dynamic between politics and spirituality, or
because obviously your own background has been in very political projects. I'm curious how you connect these two worlds.
For me, it's inherently connected, as you expressed, earlier in this conversation. To me, it makes complete sense that politics is meant to be about what moves us as humans and what it is that we want to create for ourselves and for each other. But it's all very cynical now. I kept my toe in for a good decade, and now I feel like I still kind of from the sidelines, like watch what's happening in Westminster, but it feels now like this kind of almost like alien world to me. And I guess that's because when you've spent so much time understanding trauma and like authenticity and like the driving force behind us as human beings of like what informs how we act and what we do and what we value, and then you don't see that reflected at all, it's really exhausting. And I would love for there to be some kind of renewal, and yet I'm not sure like how it's going to meet those edges, because so many of the brilliant people that I've come across don't know how to relate to the power structures anymore. And I feel like that's also something interesting that happens because people want to shift their consciousness. Like, you know, I think a lot of us in our subculture have been through the, you know, wisdom is changing yourself after years of trying to change the world. But then I feel like what happens is then you get to a place where you can't relate so well to some of what is the most mainstream. And we have like a parliament where it's just like okay somehow that they were having parties during lockdown whilst we were doing what they told us to do and not going to funerals and this kind of thing. And that, you know, ministers are going on, I'm a celebrity, get me out of it. Like we're kind of living in this like such insane kind of parody that I am finding it harder and harder to connect to. And I have so much respect because there are some people that are able to be within that world, and I do feel are doing miraculous work, that they are connecting to a sense of grace and they're able to hold their integrity in amongst a culture that is really like quite disgusting. For me, I've lost the ability to do that due to my own burnouts. I guess not associating too much with the payoff, like the benefits that you get from being in that world. They don't feel important enough to me to kind of put myself through that. That sounds a little bit depressing in terms of what that means for our future, because I don't know what happens if we all go off into these different subcultures and the actual mainstream decision-making bodies lose a lot of like people that want to change the system.
Well, I suppose it is depressing, and it's also pointing at what needs to be done. And so I think what you just described, this process of shifting your consciousness, in a way, what came to mind is it's a process, first of all, of de-armoring yourself and of increasing your sensitivity to what's going on in your body and with your emotions and what's going on in your mind, and seeing, wow, there's like a lot of wounding and trauma here, as there is in everyone, and this is what plays out in our culture. And so there is less of an ability to play what is a blood sport. That's what politics is, or at least is to date. I think that it, like many kind of systems that we have, it rewards a particular type of character that is able to armor themselves up to the hilt, to the point of even potentially being neurodivergent and having low levels of psychopathy and, you know, things that allow us to function in highly stressful environments. It's a kind of a terrible paradox in a way. As you go deeper into your own journey, you're less able to engage in the structures that are needed to influence wider society. And there's also, as you discover more of who you are, you're obviously wanting to find your tribe and find the others. And that again has a kind of a perverse spillover effect, in that it removes you more from people that you should be in discussion with and building bridges with. I think that this is something to be talked about, is the subtle negative consequences of a movement that of people pursuing their own personal journeys. It is, there's been lots of critiques of this, but there is a neoliberal quality to it. And, you know, with AI and the metaverse, I feel the the pathways that allow us to go further down our own rabbit hole with our own people who think like us and talk like us in filter bubbles, it all compounds. You talked about these miracle workers, people that you know and that I know, who are, deep in their own spirituality and journey and very much of this culture, and yet are still engaging with politics, or they're still building bridges. And when I speak to them, there is just like a different level of duty, and there is a capacity to kind of armor themselves up as they engage in that world. And I think we saw an expression of that in Extinction Rebellion when that exploded onto the scene. It's like, okay, this is a way to get back involved in politics, albeit through direct action. But the actual more day-to-day politics, which is just so full of mundane compromises and, as you say, parody like trivia and bullshit and harassment and abuse, that type of politics, I think, is bereft of this perspective because it's impossible to be in. And yet I remember I saw Philip Glass has an opera of Mahatma Gandhi's life, and in particular the Hindu idea of satyagraha, the idea of sacrificing yourself and giving yourself to social justice and a collective purpose. I'm sure you would be much better able to speak about this than I, but I was so incredibly moved by this. It's an incredible opera, and if you type in Satyagraha into Spotify, the soundtrack is unbelievable. It's performed entirely in Sanskrit, but it's this incredible reminder that there can be this visionary ideal of essentially oneness enacted in politics at great personal and collective sacrifice that leads to tangible difference. We can't relinquish that. That has to happen. Well, I'd be interested in more of a spotlight being put on the people who are actually doing it, even if at the moment it's small and provincial and parochial, because I think that's amongst the most important work we can do right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like where we're at with the media and social media and the kind of what's fake, what's not fake, what's a conspiracy theory, what's real, it's a really complicated time to be alive and to take action. And I feel that a lot of people do feel like they are putting themselves out there for social justice, but the ways that we're doing it are changing. And yet there's something about this change that feels very ungrounded, and it feels so unquantifiable. I was listening to something in recent weeks where there's this sort of discussion of this time being, a war of ideas that we're in, and how complex a reality that is to live your day to day in, and to know kind of what it is that to get behind or to speak out on, and that there are real consequences as well in terms of cancelling, in terms of being deplatformed, could potentially go to a social credit system, and could mean that you're in a situation where, because you've been vocal about something, you might lose rights. And it's a really complicated time.
No doubt. I mean, I remember when I was working with Extinction Rebellion, I was one of the people coordinating their political strategy for the 2019 rebellion. So that was this 2-week window in October after the big breakthrough in April in 2019. And I remember I got into that by critiquing them online. I was making videos about Extinction Rebellion, critiquing their strategy under the alter ego banner. One of them was, the video was called "Does Extinction Rebellion Have a Hippie Problem?", which is a provocative title, guilty of clickbaiting, but it was the idea that, if you want to build a mass movement, you have to build complicated majorities. You have to build majorities of people who don't think like and talk like and act like each other. And so we need to see less yoga on Waterloo Bridge and more nurses and policemen and vicars getting arrested so people can see themselves. But there was another video, which was, what can Extinction Rebellion learn from Nigel Farage? And it was generally looking at his ability to speak to people in regional UK, people from working class backgrounds who feel this sense of betrayal by the political system, and how Extinction Rebellion could do that. But the minute I got into that position in Extinction Rebellion, there was an article in Vice magazine written about me saying, I think that the title was "Extinction Rebellion is run by middle-class white men," and cited me and Roger Hallam as two examples of this. And then underneath, tucked in, also Ronan is a right-wing sympathizer. And it's just like, and you know, I think that the overall critique is an important one to have about the representation of any organization, and whether it is predominantly run by people from middle class backgrounds or white people or men. But there was such a distortion of and misrepresentation of me in order to score a political point. And that's within the left. That's not even before you get out to people that we might be more actively trying to unify around and overcome. I don't know. I've gone from someone who used to do a lot of that and think that was normal to really not doing that at all, and being essentially afraid of kind of putting anything out in the political space, or not even the political space, just in general, because it's just too much. I had there was a summit with the Dalai Lama in late October, which is its own story. But you know, the Dalai Lama is incredible, but now very old. He's 88, and we were there with him for 2 days. It was a meeting that was about 15 of us that were involved in social change. And there was obviously so much expectation going into that about how he would be. And my experience was basically, this is bullshit. It's just returning to the same basic ideas again and again. We just need to remember we're one, and we're a world of 8 billion people. And so, and at some point, I basically kind of called bullshit, and I just said, look, I just think this is completely oversimplistic and sentimental. And, you know, how will the Taliban have a spiritual shift in its perspective, or what? Like, China basically doesn't give a shit about what Tibet thinks or what you think. And like, none of these ideas, none of this like ultimate soft power is going to have any sway over regimes that are, you know, you could say there's an element of sociopathy at least to them. And I remember I posted that online, and like, very small thing, and there was, you know, lots of people were like, wow, that's like rare to see, no one challenges the Dalai Lama. And there was just also loads of abuse, and it was like, wow, I'm certainly not doing that again.
Was this on your own social media, or is this on public social, like public somewhere?
I think it's so the Irish Independent, which is Ireland's, I think, kind of largest daily broadsheet, are publishing a story about it that's coming out soon. But it was just on like the basics, like Twitter, my Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm using those two examples, but particularly the latter example, because it was just, you know, my own kind of, this is something that happened that was unusual, and kind of starting a conversation about where are the Dalai Lama's ideas on some level a bit platitudinal in our political context. But having not done it for years, as I said, because of my health stuff and because of burnout, to going back to doing something, and I say vaguely political, I was just like, it was almost like immediate retreat. I was like, whoa, what? Like, couldn't imagine doing this day to day. So again, it just, I want to speak to your point that the space in which to fight for ideas is a much trickier and scary place right now. And I can totally understand why people want to run a million miles away from it. And also why I have so much respect for people who are fully on that journey of desensitizing themselves, or sensitizing themselves, and are still willing to stand up and to speak out.
Yeah, I feel something that I've learned on my journey is that in order to stand up against something, or to really be like the truth teller, or the one that's not afraid to say the uncomfortable thing, which unfortunately has been my way of being for a lot of my life. It's always been obvious to me, perhaps also being a minority in most spaces that I'm in, often the only woman in earlier parts of my work life, and then pretty much always the only person of color. And so just seeing things in a slightly different way, and then challenging that perspective. And I guess there was one, well, there was many, but there's one example within a community, so in person, not online, but having to be the voice of that perspective was just so intense. And since then I've been a lot more careful, because I've realized that if you don't have the right support around you, and that support is, you know, financial, it's physical safety, it's spiritual and energetic, you know, because you're opening yourself up to so much. And so having that right support structure is what makes it possible. And also knowing that, you know, we are living at times of such enormous inequality, and there is a lot of money behind certain ideas. And that I really learned when I worked on the Yes to Fairer Votes campaign for the alternative vote that we had. And I was a spokesperson for that. And honestly, there was a day where I just burst into tears. I cried all day in the office, and everyone went, "We've lost Amisha. We've officially lost the referendum." It's like 3 days before the vote. And because everything I was seeing at just how like money was being thrown at trying to confuse people, at political agendas, and how the thing that we were talking about, you know, I think now, gosh, like, how would the alternative vote have changed the last 13 years of British and therefore global politics, you know? And at the end, it was just by a whisper, but a lot of money went at that at the very last minute. And so that's there behind all these structures. And so I do feel like it's important to be resourced. And yet it's also kind of, it's kind of difficult. So I guess there's a thing about picking one's battles. And there's also a thing around being as generous and kind with support as you can to people that you see that are doing something that is inspiring, where they're challenging something. And, you know, for me, it's often just writing someone a little note saying, really inspired by what it is that you're doing, or like joining people's memberships or Patreons or whatever it is in order to help resource people. Because I think so often we don't understand what the other side of that is.
I think you're pointing to something incredibly important, which is that not all of us, or at definitely different points in our life, have the capacity, you know, to do what you're talking about, be a spokesperson for an incredibly important political issue and bear the flack of that. And it's a real crucible. I see so many people in the kind of the wider spiritual community who have deep skills in holding and in teaching people how to be resilient and to heal themselves and to support themselves, who are often kind of lost politically and kind of just a bit disengaged, not wondering how to relate to it. And often the best way they can relate is by providing that direct one-to-one support to someone who is choosing to sacrifice themselves. I've been trying to find my own way back into the activism and politics space, and I'm doing leadership and resilience coaching with a particular organization that I won't name, but is in the media spotlight, and the consequences they're individually facing for their actions are just massive. I found a really lovely way to be involved, to be able to share something that I think is valuable, and also honor the fact that I can't do that right now. You know, you speak about the consequences, you know, not just reputationally, not, you know, I think the example that you raised from the gathering that I'm somewhat familiar about in a way is the deep personal consequences of like relationships and community. And then when you take it into the political, you know, the most recent thing I've been reading about is lawfare. So lawfare is basically using the legal system as a weapon, primarily against activists and investigative journalists who are exposing corruption primarily. So Peter Keoghan, who's the editor of Open Democracy, I guest edited a series for Open Democracy about 7 years ago on the relationship between spirituality and politics. Open Democracy now is doing pretty incredible investigative journalism of very, you know, just high levels of corruption. There's a particular type of court action which is called a slap action, and it's basically the idea that you can sue people for libel in the UK courts. You can draw out that pre-court process for years and just basically consume vast amounts of their money in legal bills. And just before it goes to trial, you can pull out because you know you don't even have a case. So the example he described was, I think, the Azerbaijani government using some kind of offshore account for money laundering. And, you know, that's both individual journalists and small media outlets are just being hobbled and are unable to function because of the losses that they have. You know, again, I'm not trying to draw us into bleak town, but it underscores, I think there's an invitation in this of how could we, like you say, support people that we believe are doing incredible work financially, and if they need it in terms of whatever gifts that we have.
Thank you for tuning in. If you are enjoying this episode, do join our membership. For a small contribution, you can be part of our community, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and embodiment. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show. keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all. And you receive a number of benefits, such as monthly soul space, going deeper sessions, access to our library of workshops, and discounts on all our online and in-person experiences. Our membership is what makes us able to make this show and stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Head to allthatweare.org/membership to find out more and join today. I feel that it also speaks to the critique that we were talking about earlier about Extinction Rebellion and the kind of middle class aspect of it. It's very hard to put yourself on the line if you don't have like financial backing of any sort. This is why we often see that. And, you know, I know that a lot of people of color activists that are even just talking about racism are getting death threats sent to their houses, you know, and being told to go back to wherever we came from. We don't know which dimension we came from, so how to go back there. But yeah, there is something there. All of this that we're talking about, one of the themes within this is the resilience that's needed to stay active and awake and present at these times, which I feel like no matter how political you see yourself, it's really a life skill. There are a lot of factors at play that are making life crunchier, whether that is the cost of living changes, whether that is AI coming in and job security, whether that is health, that I know that there are just more viruses right now than there were. I spoke to a doctor this morning who said it's now very normal to get quite a full-on virus every 2 to 3 months. Some of that's to do with how lockdown and us kind of making our world smaller has changed our immune systems, but also that there was an article in Time magazine saying that actually it's also just nature's creating more viruses. There's also the impacts on our brain and the kind of healthy function of our brain, which requires a bigger world and a thriving community. And I do feel that not everyone has managed, even in this amount of time, to get back to the level of activity and community and friendship that they had before the pandemic. And that has an impact on our brains as well. So there's so many things, and that's just a little scattering. Of course, you can add in war and rising toxicity, all kinds of things. So we are being asked to be more resilient. What does that mean from the research that you've been doing around resilience?
It's helpful to anchor these conversations in, I think a good working definition of resilience is the ability to cope well with setbacks and the ability to adapt well to change and disruption and the ability to keep going in the face of adversity. I often, when I'm talking to people, I try and help them operationalize that by seeing their lives as a stool with 4 legs. And each of these legs is a pillar that basically upholds our life. And so the 4 legs of the stool for me are your work leg, which is also your source of kind of income and your financial buffer, your primary relationship, if you're in a romantic relationship, or your closest relationships to you that really uphold your life, your home dynamic. Do you have a place of home, a place of safety and privacy and relaxation? And finally, your mental and your physical health. It's not perfect. There are other aspects of the pillars or other way of describing them. But the way I would put some context on this is that we are just overexposed to increased volatility and increased complexity and increased relative hardship. So it's very easy for any one of these legs of the stool to either be kind of rattled a bit or just be completely taken off. And all of a sudden you go from someone that has thought of yourself as resilient to being on the floor struggling to get up. So I think, you know, the convergence, as you say, of economic insecurity and the pandemic and a general environment of anxiety, it means that it's often quite rare if you check in with someone and often in my friendship group, among some of my friends, we won't say how are you, we'll say like, how are the pillars of your life or how are the legs of your life. It's very rare, and I think for anyone listening, they ask themselves that question or ask their close friends that question, that there wouldn't be one leg that isn't very wonky or two legs that are just completely not there. And we've spoken about the legs of our own stool and just how challenging they are. And
I don't think my stool has legs at the moment. and I'm sure that everyone listening wouldn't even know that.
Yeah, well, I'd be curious to, maybe just to share a bit more about that. Like, so, because obviously people are interacting with you as, I imagine on some level, it'd be very easy to project a particular, positive image about you and your life and where you go and what you do. And I'd be curious for you to, maybe if I was to ask you, how are the legs of your stool? How are the legs of your stool?
So what are the 4 legs again?
uh,
Home, mental and physical health, primary relationships,
and work, which is also your source of income.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have any legs on my stool really right now.
And how is that?
It's challenging. Like, just tears just came to my eyes just for a second then. I'm an incredibly resilient being, and I experience grace a lot, but I don't have a place that I'm living at the moment. I'm in between places. My primary relationship right now is my mother, who I've been caring for 3 years, and she's really changed a lot in that time, and it's pretty full on. Like, and I'm being very English now suddenly. I'm using words like white and pretty. And I've been having a very full on health year or so. Yeah, and work's been a real challenge. I invested my time and energy in the wrong things like last year. Like, we had a developer run off with the money for the community platform that I wanted to build. I just didn't have the space actually to do the bit that I'm really good at, and everything sort of feels like it's dissolved a bit. But I also feel like my stool has no legs. I do feel like the legs are coming back. They're going to be stronger. I believe in kind of death and rebirth. There's a kind of spiritual process, and I've definitely been in a massive death in a big underworld space, and I feel some kind of emergence, but it's also just got really normalized. It's been like 3 years or so since I would have been able to say, maybe even longer, maybe 4 years since I could have said, oh yes, strong legs.
Thank you for sharing and kind of inviting us into what's going on for you. And it sounds incredibly challenging. To have all 4 is no joke. I suppose what it points us to, because you were asking about how to be resilient. Resilience begins when we actually start to fully acknowledge the degree to which we're actually compromised. A lot of people are in hiding from that confrontation. It's only when we truly essentially diagnose our situation and understand what's going on in our life in all of its complexity and all the stresses on it, that we can see, there's many things that you described there that are beyond your control, and they are, the function of forces that are beyond your control. The struggles you're having caring for your mum are the product of a broken care system, amongst other things.
And systemic racism and increased toxicity of our planet and all kinds of things that have led to this situation.
And this is, I think, where it gets interesting, is that, yes, that's true. And I think one of the core aspects of resilience is, even in situations where you don't have a lot of agency, it's understanding where you do and really acting on that. And I don't know what that looks like for you, but I try and ask myself, how do I protect myself from being overexposed to, for example, broken systems? What does it look like to make sure that I have a health buffer so I can actually go through a period of phenomenal stress and not be broken by it? What does it look like for me to really look at the kind of work that I'm saying yes to and choosing? And is that compromising my financial buffer to ride out insecurity and storms? What is the health of my relationships, so that if I'm in a tight spot, I have put enough into my community and my friendship networks that I can reasonably expect the same level of support back. Supporting someone who's going through a very severe mental health crisis at the moment. And I think partly one of the difficulties is that support network is faltering because of where they've chosen to prioritize their time and their work. And it's really terrible to see. And so I think that there's a lot outside of our control. And I do think on a very fundamental level, we are living in a very broken, toxic system that is really impacting us across the board. And we have to learn how to survive that in a way. And I think that there are ways of intelligently navigating it. In a way, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to distinguish between two types of resilience. There's the kind of classic resilience, which is learn how to manage your stress and regulate your breathing and eat well and sleep well. And like all of that is the realm of personal resilience. It's very important to understand how to not deplete yourself, how to build up your resources, how to have a buffer. But there's another type of, I would say, tactical resilience, of how do I navigate a world where I can be really exposed to curveballs. And even though I don't have full control, I can still navigate it to reduce my exposure and leverage opportunities to increase my buffer in all of those domains, financial health, relationships, etc.
Yeah, I feel like that's really interesting, because what we don't respond well to is to-do lists of things that we're supposed to be doing, and yet trying to find ways of resourcing ourselves. And I also find for me that allowing myself to be really present to what is, there's a big process of kind of letting go of what we thought life was going to be like, or what we imagined. Because also we often imagine our lives at a different time, So I imagined my life in the 90s was when I imagined what it would be like to be 40. And of course, it was just like a very different economic, cultural, social time.
What did 9-year-old Amisha imagine?
Well, I imagined by now that I would have children and a big, beautiful house. I'd be doing really beautiful work in the world, and there wouldn't be climate change happening. My parents would be really healthy, and they would be an active part of a multi-generational living, and that I would be doing really beautiful work, and there wouldn't be any kind of financial struggles, trade-offs within that. Yeah, I imagine something way less complicated than what it is right now. And I also know that this is a moment, it's a season. It doesn't mean that the rest of my life is going to be as challenging as the last years have been. It can be really challenging to do things outside of the socialized timelines. And so I've had to do a lot of work around letting go of conditioned socialized ideas of what is supposed to be, and then drawing, a different kind of understanding around it, an understanding of, okay, so what's it going to be like to have children without grandparents? There's a lot of grief in that. And there's also a whole liberation current within it that is unusual, to be in a country where there's no deeper generations. A lot of my work has been around the deconditioning of patterns and creating that sense of our own inner liberation and cultural liberation. And now I'm living it, and it's way more complex than I imagined, because actually there's a lot of comfort in doing things within the supported structures, or the structures that have been there before. And so within that, there's a different kind of resilience that I'm having to learn.
I think what you just described is such a beautiful example of what a resilient mindset looks like. Because what you described, the thing that I felt as you described what 9-year-old Amisha imagined and the reality you're living now, was so much grief of the mismatch of those expectations. And I think for people who are unresilient, there isn't another sentence that follows that. They are mired in a grief and despair that becomes a vicious cycle. In a way, there's runaway thoughts and rumination and fixation. There's emotional components that they don't have a handle on. And then you can go into really self-sabotaging patterns of numbing and distracting yourself with all kinds of addictions. And that's where, someone gets dealt a difficult hand. And I think that in relation to your expectations, that is a difficult hand to have been dealt. And I think it's partly generational. I think that the social contract of, okay, I'm going to give myself to work. It doesn't even have to be meaningful. And in exchange for 30 years of my labor, I can expect to be able to buy a home, and it not even just be a home, but maybe a home that I like, and be able to raise a family there. And, my parents will be there to look after them, and I'll be there to look after my parents. Like, that is our deeply encoded cultural expectation.
Yeah. A home with a downstairs bathroom. They're expensive.
Yeah.
Or downstairs bedroom, I meant. But yeah, to be able to accommodate multi-generational living.
Exactly. But you didn't stop there. You talked about the work you're having to do, which I also see a lot of friends of mine who are in our similar age group, unlearning and freeing ourselves and liberating from that beautiful phrase that you just uttered, the socialized timeline, this inherited cultural idea that I must have done the following things by this day, and if I don't, I'm an abject failure, and the personification of a structural crisis as a moral failing. And that's just a really good example of, and then reorientating and ask, okay, well, this is how my life is presenting itself. Where is the invitation in this? Where is my growth, and where are the opportunities? And that, I think, more than do Wim Hof and eat this supplement or do whatever else, like all of that, I think, is in the realm of cosmetic resilience. There's actually a deeper way of relating to the tragedy of life and the grief of life, where you bend with it, you're not broken by it. You allow, the analogy of how they build buildings in Japan, where there's lots of earthquakes, they have soft foundations that can move with the tremors and not collapse the building. Just in your description of how you're responding to your life situation, I think that you've exemplified actually a lot of the deeper principles of resilience.
Ah, my stool feels a little bit better now. Thanks for
It's like you're taking the legs of your stool that have broken off and you're turning them into a little drum kit.
Yeah, they're still invisible legs, but I do feel, I mean, I guess I feel like that's where hope and grace is such an important aspect of it, because there's something about being able to feel the grief that you are currently feeling, and also feel the possibility, and not have to rush it to get to the solution, but being able to hold space for the possibility of what is to come, but also be with the grief. And I would love your perspective on that, because there's a lot of victim shaming that happens these days, and in the kind of spiritual self-help world. You don't want to be a victim, you've got to be a warrior all the time. For me, I can't be a warrior unless I'm allowing myself to feel and to process the deeper grief, the deeper shame, the deeper trauma of what I've experienced. That's actually what helps me to be strong and graceful. Obviously, there is a line where you then get stuck in a trauma loop. And then because you're in that place of so much grief and darkness, you can't find your way out. I'm curious as to what you feel about that.
Well, there's a saying, I forget who said it, but one of the markers of genius is being able to hold two opposite ideas simultaneously. And when I hear you speak, I hear you holding the opposing ideas of grief and despair, and fully being in it and fully living it and honoring it, and also not being so consumed by it that you forget that the perspective that this is transitory and temporary, and there will be renewal. And like you said, there are cycles of death and rebirth. There is possibility, and that capacity to hold ultimate grief and ultimate possibility at the same time is one of the core skills that and muscles that we need to grow in this time, because there is both. And as someone who has been in chronic pain for now 5 years, and I have such deep grief, every morning I wake up with the daily reminder that my nervous system is really not working and is way overly dysregulated and sensitized, and I wake up with that pain and have to spend an hour and a half pulling my body out of the worst of that pain so that I can be functional for the rest of the day. The only conclusion my mind can draw is, well, this is clearly permanent, this is clearly the way it's going to be. And then my mind runs away with, well, how am I going to have a family? How am I going to raise children? How am I going to deal with sleep deprivation? What happens if my partner dies? And resilience is stopping that runaway train in its tracks and going into the feeling and being like, yeah, like, wow, like I really hear you and I feel you in that despair and that grief, and allowing time for that, and also entertaining possibility. I just wanted to honor that. And you were asking me about the prevalence of victim shaming, and this idea that you just have to kind of be a warrior and keep going. My only sense of that is that if you're fronting, or if you're in a culture that is asking you to front, it doesn't matter from what quarter it comes from, it's just complete bullshit and nonsense. And that someone's pain is there, and it's not going to go away until it's fully honored. And some pain needs to just be continually honored because it's really deep and it's long lasting. And in a way, the grief workers that I've encountered would say that it's just a never-ending process. There is just this current of pain running through our life that we need to honor and also not be swept away by it.
Yeah, it is having the ability to do both. And I'm curious around the kind of space holding when you have people in your life that are struggling in different ways, and that line between being really like supportive and not fixing, and allowing them to be where they are in the challenges that they're facing, and how that really, really feels. And it's like, it's so funny because the words that's coming is like enabling their suffering. And it's like, it's not even my language. It's I know who it's coming from actually, but also like being able to help to actually lift them out, or to encourage them towards small things that will help to resource them better.
Well, what comes to mind, and it's an extreme example, but in Alcoholics Anonymous and in the family support circles of families who have someone in your family is an alcoholic, that the family needs to accept its own powerlessness in the situation, and that needs to come out of its own pattern of enabling and allow the alcoholic to reach their rock bottom, so their own suffering becomes intolerable and they become motivated to change. But along that descent into the rock bottom, constantly affirm their presence and their love, and that they can come to them when they're ready. And that's an incredibly, not that I've ever had to experience it personally, I've had neighbors back home who have dealt with it very severely, but that's such a difficult thing to do, because you have to confront your own pain and your own despair of someone that you love dearly suffering, and also the kinds of fear it brings up in you that something like that could happen to you. So it's an incredibly uncomfortable situation, and in a way we try and wish it away by fixing the person in order to save us from our own pain. But we circle back around to actually one of the core principles of resilience, which is your ability to tolerate difficulty, your capacity to hold really difficult, complex, intense, ambiguous life situations that don't seem to have an ending, and often the cause of it is even obscure. And just being able to be in that crucible of suffering and be able to hold it is the capacity that we need to learn and to grow in.
Thank you for that, Ronan. I feel, just to share with everyone, because I don't know at this point what I've shared with this community or not, but my mum has Parkinson's and dementia. And actually, we've been off air for 6 months, and it has got a lot worse during that time. that's one of these things it's very complex. There's a lot of grief involved because you're seeing somebody is alive, but they're so different to the person that you've known your whole life. And you have no idea how long the journey is. It's not like raising toddlers where you know that they are in like 2 years going to be able to brush their own teeth, and then they're going to go to school and you're going to get those hours of the day. It's a different kind of journey. And also to share because I have shared on this podcast that I moved into a community house in order to receive more support, and unfortunately that's just not what unfolded. And then the health with the mold and the pesticide poisoning is a big factor of what's made my health so much worse this year. So I just want to share that I'm okay, and it's a lot of complex situations, and that through it I'm just transforming into somebody else, that's also okay, and it's beautiful. I'm experiencing these really profound moments where I realize that I'm doing great, like in and amongst all of the complexity. And then there are times that have been incredibly hard and incredibly difficult, because I don't know anyone that's going through the same things, all of the same things at the same time. And then that can be really challenging. I suppose I'm sharing this just because we shared a little bit, and I didn't want to be like so cryptic that everyone listening was like, what's wrong?
And thank you for sharing it. And again, like I said, that sounds like an incredibly, even just one alone would be like a burden to carry, and to carry them all together, it just feels incredibly difficult. And it just really touched me when you talked about that idea of like, there isn't okay, I've got sleepless nights, but in 2 years my kids will be in a bedtime rhythm and there'll be a reprieve. And there's something about that I think is the most challenging aspect of adversity, is that we can all deal with adversity if we know there's some general shelf life on it. And actually the most difficult adversity is, as I say, it's ambiguous, it's open-ended. When you were speaking, hearing you saying, but you're really leaning into it and transforming and getting all of these insights and having these moments of freedom. My instinctive response when I heard that was amazing. And I feel like I really wish for you to be able to receive the support that you need. We spoke earlier about, if you see someone whose work you admire and you're doing, then support them. So especially if they have added burdens in their life. And so we set an intention at the beginning of this podcast that just this conversation could be meaningful to everyone that listened to it, and it could be transformative. And I also wish that for you.
Thank you, Ronan. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, I am able to connect with you and share some of the rockier moments with the stool legs. I feel like the thing that I wanted to say was that, at some point when I started to understand human psychology and people's insecurities, that you get to that understanding that, when you walk into a room and if you're not feeling confident and you assume everyone else is really confident and it's just you that isn't. And then you start to understand that, that person's overconfidence is masking this, or that person's coldness is masking this, and that person's like people pleasing over friendliness is masking this. And you realize that, okay, we all have these different patterns that are playing out. And what I want to say now is that with everything that we're going through, that we really don't know what people are going through. And that's always been the case. Of course, that's always been the case, but that mental health issues are much more prevalent. Neurodiversity is much more understood, that there are still like a lot of ricochets of what's been happening over the past years, or what is happening, what this time might be, what's churning inside of people. And so being as generous as we can be with each other. For example, I did a whole bunch of talks this summer. I did like 9 events over the summer, festivals and things. I really felt the need to get back out there and to be with people. I had headaches at all of them because of the toxicity stuff that I was going through with the pesticides and whatnot. And you wouldn't necessarily know, but it's very easy to assume, oh, that person's rude, or that person didn't, respond to me in the way that I was hoping that they would, or that person was really like arrogant because they didn't want to chat to me. And also, when you are at an event, you also don't want to talk about all of those things because you're trying to have a break from that kind of complexity and kind of be and enjoy the experience and have some inspiring conversations and have a dance or whatever else. And so there's something in our kind of new tools around relating with each other to step even deeper into just being really spacious around people and managing triggers around reactivity of what it means to come into contact with someone, especially at in really busy places.
Well, yeah, I think that, what's coming to mind is, it's almost a cliche, but, assume positive intent. There's the older expression, don't ascribe to malice what could be explained by incompetence. But in a way, I want to shift that, which is don't ascribe to malice what can be explained by a lack of capacity or someone dealing with their own difficulty. That idea of, I suppose, the more we tap into our own legs of the stool, how difficult it is for us, I would say, just even using that lens of, I wonder what's going on for that person, that might explain my encounter with them, rather than where my mind immediately goes, because where our mind immediately goes is often just a reflection of our own wounding. I imagine it's something that you probably face is, people who struggle with claiming their own power being really triggered by you. The psyche doesn't know what to do with that, so they will pick up on any cues from you that you're XYZ and then say, that's Amisha. And that's, a really big burden to carry. And it's all the more heightened when you're actually in these positions where you're giving talks at things, and there's a certain degree to which you're both pedestalized and projected upon in positive ways. I'm using parentheses there because it also can create a disconnection, and then you're pulled off the pedestal because people don't want you there. And so there's it's something I've experienced, and when I really meet mature people who've done a lot of work on themselves, when they have these negative interactions, they're just less likely to run into stories about the other person and assume positive intent and come back to what this experience might be revealing about themselves. Again, the quote from Carl Jung, everything that annoys us about the other leads us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. And it's not that every interaction has to be some kind of personal growth mission, but even just having a degree of compassion and curiosity about our instinctive reaction to someone is usually revealing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel it's another tool of resilience, so that you're not so impacted by everyone else, because you're able to not take things personally, and to just to give spaciousness to interactions. I think one that I get sometimes is that the spaciousness and the presence and the depth I will bring to this conversation. This conversation is the main thing that I'm doing today, and I've created a lot of space in my day in order to be here with you. It's not the same version of me that you get 3 days into a festival. And so then I'm actually maybe trying to avoid talking to people because there's I'm sort of in an overwhelm. It's also allowing not just the complexity of ourselves, but the complexity of others. And I feel like we understand our own complexity, that there are so many different versions of us, and yet we often imagine that other people are just as they are in the context in which we know them.
Yeah, I'm almost wanting some kind of badge, don't mistake my aloofness for overwhelm, or something like that.
You're overwhelmed for aloofness, maybe?
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. Maybe both. Yeah. I know I might present as overwhelmed, but I'm actually deeply aloof at the moment. I know. Yeah, I like that. I like that kind of generosity around how we interact with people, and I really appreciate how you have revealed yourself to me, but obviously to your listeners. And I think there's just something very beautiful about that. So, yeah, just thank you for that. It's easy to stay in in the non-reveal space.
Yeah, it's always a dance. But I feel like we're in these times together. What's happening in each of our lives is not so dissimilar, and that there are threads. And that's why I continue to make this show, because I know that when we hear each other's stories, that we feel a connection to that part that we relate to. And that actually, if you haven't heard people talk about chronic illness, you might feel really isolated. And I know that we haven't really talked very much around your story, but I certainly, having known you for a long time, I didn't know all of what you were going through. It's been really moving to understand more of what you're holding. And then it makes me so much more respectful of and inspired by what it is that I see you do in the world. Would you mind sharing a little bit around your story? And I know we don't have loads of time, but there's something really interesting around this myth of flying too close to the sun, and also the grief aspect of your journey. You know, your brother's death in your childhood, and how that meant that grief was so present.
Yeah, I'm happy to try to share. The memory that comes up for me is my dad sitting me down maybe at the age of 9, but telling me about the myth of Icarus, which was the boy that created wings of wax and flew too close to the sun, and the sun melted the wings and he came crashing to the earth. It's such a powerful story and myth that I think speaks to so much of what we explored today, but particularly in terms of this community that is listening to this podcast and the friendship circles that we find ourselves in, that we're in this moment of civilizational breakdown. The old way is dying. We're living out the new way. And there's something about being on the bleeding edge of that is akin to flying too close to the sun. And I think that, 5 years ago, I was really at that bleeding edge of many things. I was exploring, the intersection of spirituality and politics, and, doing very financially precarious work, and working with Extinction Rebellion and nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, and was exploring plant medicine and psychedelics, which, I think now there's a really important conversation about just how vulnerable the psyche is to these things. I think that 5 years ago everyone was very much swept up in the fad of that, and then was also exploring open relating. And in a way, we all, each leg of the stool has its own stress budget and has its own buffer. And I was basically, if it was a kind of an equalizer, I was pushing all of the buttons to max at the same time. It took a crisis in my relationship, really, really difficult relationship crisis, that was really traumatic, where my partner fell in love with someone else, and I did what often people in our subculture do, which is oh, well, who am I to stop that, and I should just work on my jealousy or just work on myself. It's a personal moral failing. And I really just allowed or exposed myself to a situation that I couldn't handle. It was just deeply traumatizing for my system. And rather than, I think what's really interesting is that rather than take that as a moment to really slow down and rest and be with myself, I did what my kind of personality structure is designed to do, which is keep achieving, keep going, keep pushing through, keep plowing on, and just losing myself in work rather than tending to myself. And so, I continued on even though I was severely compromised. And I think what's interesting is that, the vulnerability to that later life event of a relationship breakdown, the seeds of that were being, at the kitchen table when my brother was knocked down by a car outside of our home, and when he was carried into our house, and witnessing him in my dad's arms, and watching that, and being 4, and it being a deeply traumatizing moment for me. But also, often when I talk about resilience, I speak about, it's not just the trauma, it's the aftermath of grief. My own family, it was rural Ireland in the 90s. I often say, there was no Brené Brown back then talking about vulnerability. There was no language to describe your experience. There was no culture of therapy. And, my family really suffered and weren't able to process that grief. The irony is that initial, primary childhood trauma just made me more vulnerable to an adverse life event later on in life that another person might have navigated okay. But the experience later on, my relationship really excavated that trauma, I think. But then ironically, my own childhood way of surviving that home environment where there was a lot of grief and, on one level, I lost my parents emotionally, which is very natural and through no fault or failing of their own. They absolutely did their best. But my way of compensating for that wound was to be a success, to achieve, to be someone in the world. And that very defense mechanism kicked in again when I was in that crisis. Is that's my primary way of knowing how to see my way through difficulty. And actually it quite tragically sowed the seeds of a deeper health breakdown, where rather than listening to my body, I just kept on pushing myself more. Took up a senior position in Extinction Rebellion, even though I had terrible PTSD and really dysfunctional gut, and I shouldn't have been doing anything remotely at the edge of my capacity. From that situation, things spiraled out of control. And I often describe any complex system, but particularly the body, it's held in equilibrium. It maintains a stability because it has these buffers that can withstand pressure to change it. It has these brakes on change to resist attempts to change it. But if you keep on running yourself beyond your capacity in the world that we have, it's very easy for those buffers to be eroded, for those brakes to be railroaded, and for your system to be pushed from one equilibrium to another. Where I was pushed to was to being in my nervous system just being incredibly sensitized and dysregulated, and having chronic pain all over my body. So I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia a couple of years ago, which is a chronic pain condition. It's brutal. It's a really brutal experience. I'm in pain every single day for the last 4 years now, and nothing I do, even though I've done so many things, seems to change that. And it's really heartbreaking. I have my routines and these things that I do to try and bring safety to my body and coax my body out of these patterns. But at best, it kind of helps me be functional, but it doesn't take the discomfort and the pain away. And so that's what I'm carrying. So I'm really, when you shared about caring for your mother and just the general pain and struggle of the last couple of years, it's just something I know really well. The thing that I fight against every day is an insistence in my mind that I'm basically fucked and I'm going to be like this forever. And it's really heartbreaking. I am embracing a more slow part of healing, this path of healing that is really slowing down and doing what I'm not wired to do, which is slow down, stay inside my window of tolerance, like really be different. And I'm finding it incredibly hard to do that. But it is, along with trauma therapy, I think the path. There's no guarantee of results. And so, everything that I shared about resilience today has come from my own little personal PhD on resilience, from having to be resilient every day. So it's not stuff I read in a blog, it's stuff that I have to apply at 6:30 a.m. when I'm really struggling. So I feel sad sharing that. It's not something that I want people to know about me. I want people to have this other image of me, but that I also understand that it's, in a way, a kind of a form of redemption for this struggle that I'm in, to be able to share it and to hopefully allow people to make contact with their own version of that, whatever that is, whatever that burden is that they carry, and also to understand how to be resilient.
Thank you so much, Ronan, for sharing that and for being courageous enough to then share something wider and bigger through what you're learning through this journey. There's two things around health that are really prevalent, and one is that it can feel really shameful to have health difficulties, especially in the times of like optimization and like be your best self. And until you have really deep health issues, you take it for granted and you kind of can't imagine what it's like. And then when that does become the center of your world, it really does change everything.
Yeah, I mentioned it to you before, but I always return to this Sudanese proverb that health is a crown worn by those who are well and seen only by the sick. It speaks so much to my experience and the experience of people who lose what is most precious to us is our health. And when it's lost, all we can see around us are the crowns of people who have that health and who take it for granted. And if there's one piece of wisdom to impart, it is to learn from the cautionary tales of others, to really not just be like, oh yeah, I heard a podcast of Ronan and Amisha, and I think they're both sick, but like to really investigate, okay, how did that happen? And to get serious about how that could happen to me, and to look and interrogate our lives more closely, and to ask ourselves, am I on that trajectory? Is this actually, could this happen to me? And just to say, like, absolutely, in bold font, it can, and you are not an exception. And I think a lot of us live with the until tragedy strikes, with a naive sense of exceptionalism to tragedy. It's like, oh yeah, tragedy is this thing that happens elsewhere in other parts of the world to other people. And it's like, no, like you could easily be a newspaper headline, but for the grace. And that's not to send people into a kind of a paranoia about what could happen to them, but there's a healthy awareness of the fragility of our lives and the freedoms and the luxuries we take for granted that I think is a powerful investment of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. I really relate to that. When I had glandular fever in my kind of major 2012 burnout, doing TEDx talks, literally lying on the floor before because I was so tired. And I remember people saying to me, oh, glandular fever, like that can turn into something really chronic. And I just remember thinking, that won't happen to me. And here we are, 12 years later, and having those deep viruses, it does mean that you can get into these chronic conditions. And so it can happen to anyone. And there's a lot of really amazing research and resources around how we can be resilient and how we can create pathways within it. And, a lot of the podcasts that I listen to are made by Americans that have a lot of money and, everything's amazing all the time. And I really hope that this podcast serves as a really beautiful antidote to that. Not, they have their merits in other ways, but that the reality that most people are living in is that they don't have 7-figure incomes coming in doing 4 hours work a week whilst they're getting to swan around the world having the best time ever in optimum health. Yeah, I hope that bringing this kind of reality into where we actually are in the world, that really serves. And Ronan, I would love for you to come and be part of one of the Going Deeper sessions that I'm going to be sharing in the membership that's just been coming through really strongly, that I want to do sessions on chronic health, on plant medicine, on polyamory and open relationships, offline, not for the podcast, but and I want to have like a sort of secret panel of guests. So it won't be like advertised, like this person's going to be there. But I will call on people that I know have had really genuine experiences with some of the themes, so that we can have like actually really deep conversations. And so, yeah, I'm going to invite you back for one of those this year. Thank you so much for being here and sharing. And how would you like people to connect with you after this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, if anything that I have shared resonates, I think you can just find me online. Just my name is Ronan Harrington, and you can type me into Google, and I have a website, and I'm really happy to connect. And I really trust that if you've been really moved by this, that I'm really open to that conversation.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. You choose what you contribute based on our sliding scale, and you become a patron whose support makes this podcast happen, as well as receiving access to a library of many resources and invitations to nourishing events. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. Me, Amisha Gadiali, producer and host, Anna Greta Folderbach, who crafts the words that accompany each episode, and Mary Chan, who edits the sound so skillfully. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.